Hello. Welcome everyone to the second of the seminars that EPIC has put on energy policy in this quarter. We're thrilled to have Ryan Weiser with us today, who is a senior scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs in Berkeley, California, I think. There he studies renewable energy in many forms, all the way going back to the planning and design and operation of these systems, as well as to sort of retrospective analysis of the economics of renewable systems. In addition to telling us today about the past, present, and future of the economics of wind power, Ryan has ongoing research about the economics of solar power, about the effects of increasing penetrations of renewables on the stability and operation of electricity grids, on the risk mitigation value of renewable electricity in a grid, as well as some ongoing research about the sort of community acceptance of renewable energy technologies inside of a local community. In addition to his affiliation at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, Ryan is a regular advisor to state and federal governments on issues pertaining to renewable energy. He is also an advisor to the Energy Foundation's China's Sustainable Energy Program, and he's on the board of Mineral Acquisition Partners, where in addition to acquiring minerals, I found out this morning they also acquire interests in wind farms these days. We're really excited to have Ryan here. This is something that's been 2 years in the making, as it turns out, and we're thrilled to hear what he's going to have to say about how low can the cost of wind power actually go. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ryan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all, and it's a pleasure to be here today. So the focus of this presentation will be to discuss both the past and also, maybe more significantly, the possible future cost reduction potential for wind energy, both onshore and offshore, and largely drawing on a study that we completed mid to late last year, an expert elicitation survey whereby we surveyed some of the world's foremost wind experts to solicit their views about the future potential cost reductions for wind energy, how much, where, and how. Before I do that, though, I do want to give folks just a little bit of an overview of the institution in which I work, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and then after I do that, I'll talk to you about a couple of other detours in the presentation that I will subject all of you to. I do want to encourage folks, if folks do have questions throughout the presentation, just raise your hand or yell out if I don't notice you raising your hand. I'm happy to be interrupted. When I have 30 slides to go and only 10 minutes more, I'll probably cease the question and answer and just kind of move through them. But until that point, folks should feel free to interrupt at any point. So let me first just start by situating all of you with what Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is and where my work sits within that much larger institution. LBL is, at its heart, a basic science laboratory. It's one of, depending on how you count, roughly 17 different Department of Energy national labs. Berkeley Lab is a civilian lab, always has been principally a civilian lab, and again, at its roots is a basic science lab that does work in biosciences, physical sciences, computing sciences, earth and environmental sciences, and finally, energy sciences and technologies. Notwithstanding my title as a senior scientist, I would say I'm more of an economist and policy analyst, so I'll be subjecting you with that stuff rather than basic science during the course of this presentation. But it's helpful to understand that this is a large institution, which is principally a basic sciences institution. It is, not surprisingly based on the name, located in Berkeley, California, $800 million annual budget, roughly, and 3,300 employees. Berkeley Lab, as a basic science institution, does a lot of basic science-y stuff, identifying chemical elements, discovering or confirming things like the Big Bang, dark energy, and all these sorts of things. And then as you move down this list, you can see much more mundane energy-related things as well. Electronic ballast for fluorescent lighting, low-energy windows, energy efficiency standards, et cetera. So it's kind of a mix of basic science on the one hand, and within my general area, very much applied science and economic and policy analysis as well. In terms of Berkeley Lab as a whole, I reside within the energy technologies area. Within that, the Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Department, or division, I guess now, and within that, the Electricity Markets and Policies Group. So this demonstrates, like any large bureaucracy, there are many layers. I'm the head of the Electricity Markets and Policies Group. That's a 30-person group doing work on energy efficiency, demand response, and smart grid, utility resource planning, utility business models, especially under high distributed energy futures, as well as electric reliability and transmission-related work. Within the scope of that 30-person group, though, my principal responsibilities are to manage a 10-person team that's doing wind and solar, not only wind and solar, but mostly wind and solar economic analysis of various types, focusing on the electric power system. Within that context, we have 4 annual reports, 3 of which focus principally on the economics, the cost of performance and the pricing of utility-scale wind, customer-sided solar, and utility-scale solar as well, and then a final annual product that looks at state renewables portfolio standards. I'll be talking a little bit more about those policy mechanisms a little later on in the talk. In addition to these annual reports, which we kind of talk about as our kind of ball and chain activities, the first annual report is really great. By the second year, it's still okay, and by about the third year, doing annual reports is not so much fun. And so in addition to doing the annual reports, we do a pretty broad range of other kinds of analysis around renewable energy markets and policies. I won't talk about that breadth for the purpose of this talk, but suffice it to say that the work that I'll be describing here in a couple of minutes falls within this broad spectrum of other work that we do going beyond our annual reports. So with that as the intro to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, I'm going to turn to the core heart of the presentation here and principally be talking about the IEA Wind Expert Survey that I mentioned a little bit before then. I'll talk to you a little bit about the approach that we used in this particular line of work. Of course, talk about our results and conclusions as well. That being said, I'm going to also go on, time permitting, 1, maybe 2 major detours. The first detour, which will really begin this talk, is to look backwards and to try to understand and convey the growth of the wind sector over the last couple of decades and the degree to which both policy and technological advancements / economic drivers have impacted that historical growth, principally in the US, but also referring to globally and emphasizing both land-based and offshore wind. So I'm going to give you a bit of kind of background and motivation basically to the survey work, the forward-looking work in this first part of the presentation. And then finally, and more speculatively, because I'm not sure I'll get to this with the available time, I may end the presentation talking a little bit about what this all means for future wind deployment potential. What does the competition look like, even with significant declines in the cost of wind energy? Can we expect that wind energy will play a primary or significant role in global electricity supply, or are there other barriers to deployment that go beyond simple economics alone? So that's the overall roadmap. Let's start with the background and motivation, focusing on historical trends. As I'm sure all of you are aware who are in the energy space, the wind energy market has been growing very rapidly over the last number of years. The chart in the top of this particular slide shows global cumulative wind capacity over time. Over the last several years, we've been adding roughly 50 gigawatts of additional capacity each year. The same was true in 2016, notwithstanding the fact that 2016 is not included in that uppermost graph. It is important to recognize that wind still is, on a global basis, a pretty modest contributor to electricity supply. Wind on a global basis represents between 4 and 5% of global electricity supply. So it's not a minor contributor, but nor is it a very substantial contributor as of yet. That being said, of course, there are a variety of countries in which wind energy really is a primary contributor to supply. Denmark, 40%, Portugal, 30%, Ireland, about 28%, Spain at about 25%, Romania and Germany hovering around 15%. So there are some smaller economies and also some larger economies there with higher penetrations. It's also important to note that some of the countries that I just referenced are interconnected into larger electricity systems. And so it's a little bit misleading to talk about Denmark, 40% of electricity supply comes from wind. Denmark heavily leans on Norwegian hydro, effectively exporting their wind at times and importing hydro at a later time. So they have a big battery in the form of Norway. But the same is not true for Portugal. The same is not true for Ireland. The same is not true for Spain. So there are a number of countries that are now experiencing 20% or so penetrations and managing their grid successfully with those higher levels of penetration. That global growth is matched, at least to some degree, with growth in the US. Since 2007, we've been averaging roughly 8 gigawatts per year of wind deployment. You can see in the upper left-hand corner of the slide that there is pretty significant year-to-year variation in wind deployment. That's largely affected by the periodic expiration and then subsequent extension of the federal tax credit, which I'll talk about a little later as one of the primary forms of support for wind energy in the US. But nonetheless, significant historical growth. To give one other bit of context, over the last decade, about 40% of the new electric generation capacity added in the US has come from wind. So 40% of all the new capacity additions over the last decade has come from wind. Contrast that with natural gas, which is about 45% or so, and then there's another 15% from coal, solar, and other resources. A lot of that deployment activity, not surprisingly, is in the center of the country where it's really darn windy. Not that much deployment activity in the southeast, as you can observe in this slide, partly due to the lack of policy endeavors to support renewables and wind in that region, but more significantly simply by virtue of the lack of any wind in the region, or very little wind. The southeast is not well endowed from that perspective. And we are seeing high penetrations in the US as well. On a national basis, wind contributes about 5% of our electricity supply. Put that in context, hydro is about 6 or 7% of our electricity supply. So within the next couple of years, wind will overtake hydropower as a source of supply in the US. Yeah?
When you talk about supply, you're talking about capacity, not actually delivered.
I'm talking electricity delivered in this case. Actually, wind has now surpassed hydro in capacity, but I don't really view that as a particularly intriguing comparison. So that's electricity supply. So wind today is about 5% of US electricity supply in terms of kilowatt hours, not kilowatts. You can see that there are a number of states that have much higher penetrations, not surprisingly. Iowa, 31%, South Dakota, Kansas, over 20%, and I think about 10 or maybe 12 states at over 10% of their electricity supply coming from wind. So pretty high penetrations in some states, including some states that are much larger. Texas at 10%, for example, is quite notable. Now, that supply is delivering impacts, perceived positive impacts. In the upper left-hand side of this particular slide, I'm depicting some analysis that we just completed a couple months ago now, maybe a month ago, that tries to quantify both the health and carbon or climate damage related benefits of wind energy historically in cents per kilowatt hour terms. In the case of climate damages, focusing on the social cost of carbon, kind of a central case in this particular instance, and air quality damages principally coming from mortality, premature mortality associated with exposure to fine particulate matter that derive ultimately from SO2 emissions. And you can see very significant benefits here. In places like California, where we have no coal plants to offset, the benefits primarily come in the form of reduced climate damages at about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you go to the central and upper central part of the country, you can see benefits that far exceed those values, largely by virtue of wind being able to offset coal power plants and reduce SO2 emissions and resultant fine particulate matter. So what's driving? Yeah.
That was historical data. That's not projections, right?
Correct.
2007 to 2013.
Yeah. Boy, you have good eyesight from back there. Yeah, that's very impressive.
And so the big drop, like in the Midwest, is in terms of the value of the benefits, is natural gas is displacing coal. And so like the wind is now displacing gas.
Yeah, there's two things. There's the displacement effect. There's also, of course, just the fact that we've had increasingly stringent environmental regulation. So the air emissions rates of existing coal plants have declined over time. And that is a larger factor in the decline here. So with this particular study, we're trying to understand is the temporal aspects. So to what degree have the marginal environmental benefits of wind declined over time as a consequence of shale gas, as a consequence of the cleanup of our coal fleet, but also to try to understand the geographic spread and to really illustrate how substantial that spread is dependent on whether you're able to offset more polluting coal plants versus highly efficient natural gas power plants. Yep.
So how does that compare to the cost of the tax subsidies?
Let's talk about that in the next slide. That is excellent plant of a question there. So you'll see here the benefits. If you look at California, it's around 3 cents. Mostly climate. If you look at other regions, it's always higher than that. As high as more than 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Though some of these benefits are temporary, right? There's an expectation that the coal fleet will continue to clean up over time and or retire. And so it's important to recognize that on a forward look, these benefits may decline with time. The production tax credit delivers a 2.3 cent per kilowatt hour 10-year incentive to wind producers. This is a tax credit that has existed since 1994. It has expired and been extended on numerous occasions, and that is one of the major drivers for that undulating growth in wind deployment over time. The latest 5-year extension was signed about a year ago now and involves for the first time a phase-out. Well, maybe that's not fully true because I suppose when you have a law that expires, that has its own phase-out attribute associated with it, but this is a 5-year phase-out of the production tax credit. Those projects that begin construction this year in 2017 will get 80% of that 2.3 cent value. Projects built next year, 60% of that value, et cetera. Over a 5-year cycle, this credit will have expired. This has been a primary motivator for wind deployment in the U.S. It has not been the only motivator. State-level activity and especially renewables portfolio standards have also played a very significant role. These are policies that in effect mandate electric utilities and other retailers of electricity to meet a certain portion of their supply needs with eligible sources of renewable energy. Every one of these 29 states has designed their RPS policies in different ways, sometimes dramatically so, but suffice it to say that of all of the new renewable generation built in the US over the last 15 years or so, about half of that new generation has been mandated by state portfolio standards. That's not to say that some of that generation wouldn't have happened even without those policy mandates, but about half of the generation is serving these mandates in some context. In addition, with the most recent increases in RPS policies in a variety of states, including Illinois, pretty substantial additional growth is still envisioned by the existing policies that are on the books. We've basically gotten halfway there to the final targets in aggregate on a national basis from the perspective of these policies. So policy has no doubt played a significant role in wind deployment in the US, but technology has also played a major role, and I'm now going to largely pivot in the direction of, if not technology, at least economics for much of the remainder of this presentation. And simply put, these turbines are not your grandmother's wind turbines, they're not your grandfather's wind turbines, they're not your mother's wind turbines. I don't know what the right comparison point is, but these are really, really enormous machines. A typical machine installed in the year 2015 in the US would be a 2-megawatt machine, have a tower height of 80 meters, and have a rotor diameter equivalent to the size of a football field. So these are just gigantic machines. Contrast that with the types of turbines installed in the 1980s through 1990 or so. Those were machines with hub heights of about 18 meters on average with a rotor diameter of 17 meters in size. So the size, just the physical size of these turbines has grown dramatically. In addition to the physical size, one important attribute and one important trend that's been a long-standing trend but has especially become apparent again over the last 5 years or so is a growth in rotor diameter, and especially swept rotor area. The swept rotor area is basically it's exactly what it's described as. It's the swept area of the rotor. It's basically the energy capture area for a wind turbine. And that area, if divided by the nameplate capacity of turbines, has increased over time. So the specific power has decreased, or the metric that I just described has increased. Basically, you're capturing more energy relative to the size, the nameplate capacity of the turbine. And the two trends that I just focused on, increase in nameplate capacity, really three trends, increase in nameplate capacity, increase in hub heights, and decreases in this so-called specific power, have led to significant increases in wind project performance and also significant decreases in the installed cost of wind projects. So on wind project performance, this graphic shows capacity factors. I won't describe exactly what this metric is for those of you who are not familiar with it, but it is an imperfect but still a measure of the performance of a wind project. For projects that were built in the early 1980s, a typical capacity factor for those old California wind projects might have been 12% or 14%. You can see in this slide that by the time 1998 or 1999 rolled around, typical capacity factors were around 25%. And you can see in the year 2014, which is the last full year of data that we've yet collected at LBL, those capacity factors now exceed 40% in total, with some projects reaching or nearly reaching 50% capacity factor. So this is really significant improvement in project performance over time. And it's important to recognize that that improvement has come along with a decline in the installed cost of projects. Though here the trend is a little bit more sketchy. You can see significant cost reductions from the early 1980s through about 2002. You can then see an increase in the installed cost, average installed cost of projects through about 2009 or 2010, and then a subsequent significant decline in costs since that time. And we had yeah.
So was the improvement in capacity, is this because of like a purely technological advancement in the machine, or is this because of better location choice?
Yep. Yeah, it's a little bit of both, but it's mostly technology change. If you traced over time, so the question for those of you who didn't hear it, how much is this a technology story, and how much of it is, are you just placing wind projects in progressively higher wind resource regimes, right? So how much of it is technology, how much of it is siting? It's almost all technology. It's true that from this time frame, 1998, through 2011 or so, we were actually progressively deploying projects in slightly lower wind speed sites. However, since 2011, that has changed such that projects installed in 2014 were installed basically in the same quality of wind resource site as 1998 and 1999. And so the fact that we were, for a period of time, building projects in slightly lower wind resource sites is one of the key reasons why you don't see capacity factors improving over this range here. And the reason that we're seeing this is that we've now gotten back to wind resource sites that are similar to these ones. And so if you just look at that bar and this bar, it's purely technology. But if you look at some of these intermediate bars, it's a mix of both technology and siting. Yeah?
So I just want to clarify about technology. And just correct me if I'm wrong, but the extraction of energy from the wind is not improved. What's happening is that they're putting bigger rotors on, and so they're driving the turbine closer to its capacity, so its stated capacity factor goes up. But it doesn't mean we're better at getting energy out of the natural environment. It just means you have bigger rotors with a smaller turbine.
Yep. Yeah, and not only bigger rotors relative to smaller turbines, but higher hub heights, right? You're accessing higher quality winds by getting higher up as well. But I think that's very important. From a physical science perspective, the improvements here are not exactly efficiency improvements. If you're an engineer focused on figuring out how to minimize materials use and minimize loads and shed loads and figure out how to deploy these massive machines without the blades flying off, this is very much technological improvement, but it's not in the form of a significant physical efficiency increase. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment. One key point of higher towers is you get away from the boundaries. And so there is an efficiency issue there.
There can be.
The second one, you
So these outliers, these are a lot of like one turbine projects in New England. I mean, there's some other stuff there, but a lot of those outliers are just sort of peculiar projects that small turbines, small projects, difficult terrain, et cetera. If you looked at this slide, just focused on the big interior wind belt from Minnesota to Texas and surrounding areas, there'd be a lot narrower line there. And that would be towards the bottom end of these as well. But yeah, a lot of those are kind of New England high-cost projects. Yeah.
How does that break down across the parts of the project? Say, labor cost, those things are going to change over time in the cost base depending on where they put it.
Yeah.
Versus like now you can buy a 2-megawatt turbine for this much money.
Yeah, so if you wanted to go out and buy a 2-megawatt machine, it would come to you for the low price of maybe $900 per kilowatt. So 1.8 million for that 2-megawatt machine. And that represents roughly 70% of the total cost of a project. So about 70% of the cost is the turbine, the tower. The other 40% is the foundation, the development, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, Michael?
Are these adjusted for inflation?
Yes, they are. These are all in 2015 real dollars. The consequence of those trends, the consequence of higher capacity factors and lower capital cost, not surprising, means that the power purchase agreement prices, which utilities pay for wind energy, have also declined over time, though the trend is not that simple necessarily. So each of the bubbles in this chart represents a different power purchase agreement. The size of the bubble is the size of the project. In effect, you can see there's a 50-megawatt project, there's a 150-megawatt project. It's split up among regions, but maybe we can just focus on this large interior region, the big wind belt of the US. You can see kind of accordant with this rise in capital costs over this time frame, we see a similar rise in PPA prices over that same time frame. That being said, over the last 2, 3, almost 4 years now, the average power purchase agreement price is 2 cents per kilowatt hour in the interior region of the country. In Illinois, that might be 4 cents per kilowatt hour, maybe 3.5 would be my guess. But in the major wind belt, you're talking about 2-cent PPAs. That is enabled by the federal production tax credit. I think it's very important to recognize that. So that 2-cent project would be maybe a 3.7 cent per kilowatt hour project without the 10-year federal production tax credit. So keep that kind of number in your mind. But suffice it to say, at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, you've got a really attractive product. These little black bars represent the 20-year levelized forecasted price of burning natural gas in a efficient combined cycle gas plant. So if you just think of wind as a fuel saver, it doesn't save any capital cost at all, doesn't save any fixed O&M, it just allows you to not burn natural gas in a power plant. This is the cost of that burning over a 20-year kind of expected life of a project, and you can see why in this very simple graphic, why electric utilities and corporate customers have been buying a lot of wind recently. 2 cents is a darned good deal. Now, all of the data to this point is really focused on the US. The same sort of trends are at play internationally, though in some cases maybe somewhat moderated from the US, but we've seen on the global basis reduction in capital expenditures, the upfront installed cost of projects. We've also seen significant rise in capacity factors internationally. It is perhaps notable, though, and I would make this point, that the US really is extraordinarily endowed with a heck of a lot of open, windy land area. There are very few places in the world that have as much achievable wind resource potential as the US. And so you don't see capacity factors on a global basis generally approaching the kind of capacity factors that we see in the US. All of what I've said so far is focused on land-based wind. Let me talk a little bit about offshore wind as well. Some of the same basic trends are applying, though they're coming a little bit later in terms of technology evolution. So there has been an increase in turbine size. The most typical turbines installed over the last year or so are about 4-megawatt machines. We'll talk about where that's going to go in the future a little later in the presentation. On the other hand, we've also seen progressively over time, and that's what's sort of depicted in this graph, which most of you will not be able to see, but over time you've seen projects going into deeper water and farther from shore. And so you have sort of a technology advancement story in terms of turbine size, but then you have progressively harsher environments and more costly environments in which to deploy offshore wind. And a consequence of that is that historically, we've seen really like no learning in offshore wind. The costs go up with every incremental deployment of offshore wind. It's counterintuitive and rather unfortunate if you would like to see wind energy deploy on a global basis. But a lot of that growth is because we've moved farther offshore and into deeper water. The most recent data, just over the last year or so, shows a little bit of a bending downwards of the installed cost of offshore wind. And I would also note that over the last year, there are 3 major bids that have come out of Europe, which suggest that the cost of offshore wind in a developed part of the world where plenty of offshore wind projects are otherwise being developed is now plausible at roughly 5 or 6 US cents per kilowatt hour. That is an extraordinarily low price. To give you some context, Cape Wind, a very well-known offshore wind project that died a very painful death in the US, was about a 20-cent project. Most of the other offshore wind projects proposed in the US have similarly been around 20 cents per kilowatt hour. But we have now begun to see very competitively priced offshore projects in Europe without transmission. I should emphasize that, without transmission at 5, 6, or 7 cents per kilowatt hour.
The new Rhode Island one is over 20, right?
The Rhode Island project is a 30 megawatt project. It's around 20 cents per kilowatt hour. I don't remember the exact numbers.
And it passed special legislation to do something so detrimental to consumers.
Right.
Wasn't
No.
necessarily detrimental to consumers because they were replacing expensive power from the shore and built a transmission line for it, which had all kinds of benefits. So, mixed story, but it's the first one in the United States.
Yeah, no, it's important to recognize that Rhode Island project really is kind of a unique case, right? It's off of Block Island, which is an island otherwise served by diesel gensets at a very high price. And so it did come in at 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Is it plausible that they could have gotten something cheaper? You know, you can get solar now for well below 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Let's be fair about it. But it did compete just fine against diesel gensets on the island. That is for sure. Other question? Yeah.
So on that top left chart, if you controlled for water depth, would you see a decline?
I think you'd still see an increase. I think partly because people just began to, there's a certain amount of optimism in this time frame and how people were bidding and thinking about the cost of offshore projects. So yes, they were shallow offshore, but there was also a certain amount of risk taking. And as people realized, boy, this is a really tough environment in which to build and operate a project, I think we were likely to see some natural rise, even without that kind of move towards deeper water and farther offshore sites. But again, we have begun to see, I mean, this depicts 2 of the projects. There's a more recent project that's also at 5 cents per kilowatt hour out of Europe. So there is the beginning of some evidence of very significant cost reductions out of Europe. That being said, none of those projects have been built, right? These are all bid projects, expected commercial operation date in 2020. So proof is in the pudding. Let's wait to see steel in the water.
And just sort of understand, like, what's the benefit of offshore? Is it higher capacity factor, or why is that really surprising?
Yeah, it's basically higher capacity factor. And in the northeastern U.S., it's simply the lack of developable high-quality sites, not just high quality from the perspective of capacity factor, but just developable sites, right? You cannot build wind projects on every ridgeline in the northeastern U.S. It's simply not plausible. And so some of it's just what's the competition?
Close to population centers.
Yep, close to population centers, yep. So all of this was just prelude. So the question that the expert survey tried to get at was, well, this is a pretty mature technology. Okay, you've convinced me that the costs have come down over time. But the truth is onshore wind has been around for several decades. The technology still looks visually more or less the same as it did a couple of decades ago. So surely there aren't that many more opportunities for incremental cost reduction, right? And so that was the question that we were trying to get at with this expert survey. Is this a mature technology where only somewhat modest incremental improvements are really plausible, or instead do there remain significant opportunities for cost reduction? That was really the motivation for this particular work, and to look at that both from the perspective of onshore wind technology, but also two forms of offshore wind technology. Fixed bottom offshore wind, which is the standard form of offshore wind moored to the seabed, and floating offshore wind, which is exactly as it sounds, though it's not like bobbing up and down exactly, but you have a floating platform that is moored to the bottom as well, but not through a hard foundation. So let me talk a little bit about the approach to this particular survey before talking about the results. So this was a large expert elicitation survey. It was led by myself as well as others at LBL, as well as folks at the National Renewable Energy Lab. It was conducted under the auspices of an International Energy Agency wind energy task. I will not bore you with all of those details. In the end, it was, I believe, the largest single expert elicitation survey ever conducted on an energy technology. That's not to say that it was the best expert elicitation survey ever conducted on an energy technology, but it was the largest in terms of the number of experts participating in the project. Our goals were severalfold. First, to try to estimate the magnitude of future cost reduction potential. Two, to try to understand the sources of those cost reductions, and then finally to understand the enabling conditions that might be necessary in order to achieve lower costs. So simply put, we wanted to understand how much costs might decline in the future, how we might get there, and what the uncertainty bounds around those cost reduction possibilities might be. We did cover onshore wind, fixed bottom offshore wind, and floating offshore wind, as I described a moment ago. We very much recognize that this is only one means of trying to forecast future cost reduction potential. Within the wind sector, a lot of the pre-existing literature has focused on learning curves, basically looking at what has happened historically in terms of cost reductions and simply projecting the same sort of trends will persist for all time. That's a very common way of projecting future costs, but has its own set of limitations. And another method is engineering style analysis. And at the National Renewable Energy Lab in particular, they spent a lot of time trying to understand individual technology advancement opportunities and what that might mean for both the cost and the performance of wind projects. Learning curves and engineering analysis, perfectly useful, interesting ways of understanding cost reduction potential. We wanted to bring at this problem a somewhat new technique to see how it fit in with other existing literature that was out there. Yeah?
So some countries do longer-term distribution contract tenders that are looking at periods within this medium-term time frame that you're looking at. Did you use any of those PPA results from those looking at, like Chile, for example, and that's 2021 contract start dates? Did that get into this at all?
Not really. Maybe one way of emphasizing that is that most of the analysis that maybe not most of the analysis I'm about to describe, but most of the analysis within this survey was focused on the 2030 timeframe, so beyond existing tender timeframes. We did ask our survey participants to sort of also tell us something about 2020 and 2050, but the level of rigor that we forced them into for those particular questions was substantially lower than the 2030 timeframe. So this was a beast of a project. There were a lot of folks involved. I already mentioned LBL and NREL. I also want to emphasize that we included Aaron Baker with UMass Amherst and Karen Jenny. Karen and Aaron both have conducted quite a few expert elicitations on other energy technologies, and though folks at LBL and folks at NREL could bring wind energy expertise to the table, we really wanted to have some high-quality academic minds who had engaged in expert elicitations before to help us with the method, and so they contributed in that regard. This also was truly a cross-Atlantic collaboration. It was done within the context of an IEA task, and so we had a boatload of participants and advisors from a variety of European countries as well. For the purpose of this presentation, in the interest of time, I don't want to talk too much about what an expert elicitation survey is. I suppose in the most flippant of terms, it's basically a normal survey on steroids. And so you can think of this as, yes, it's just sort of an expert survey. You're asking experts what they think. But in fact, there are a series of kind of formalized protocols to go through to try to increase the chances that you're going to get legitimate responses that are unaffected or at least mediated somehow from cognitive or motivational biases. I don't want to describe all those methods for the purpose of this conversation. As with any survey, one has to make trade-offs in terms of survey length and otherwise. In the end, we were asking our experts to basically spend, on average, 1 hour doing the survey, which is, from the perspective of a normal expert elicitation, not a huge amount of time. A lot of expert elicitations are done in person and over a multi-hour period. We wanted to survey a broader set of experts, and so we opted to do principally an online survey platform, and so had to make some trade-offs in that regard.
So a boring survey question, what was the response rate like, and did you see any underrepresentation from?
Yeah, you'll see that in a moment. Yeah, I'll show that in a moment. Yeah, Mike?
When you're doing the survey, aren't you really asking each of these experts what they think about the learning curve, the engineering assessments, and the experts?
In a way, we are. I mean, we're asking them what they believe the cost of wind energy will be in the future. Some of them, in thinking about that, might be thinking about learning curve literature. Some of them might be thinking about their own research. Some of them might be thinking about engineering assessments. And so we don't know how they generate these, but it is true that these are not fully separable methods in that as human beings, all of us try to grasp at whatever data are at our disposal. And so we may be grasping at these kinds of data when responding to these kinds of survey questions. Let me skip over this. It took a long time to do the survey, blah-de-blah. OK, so you guys would like to see results eventually, hopefully. I'd like to get to results. But I do want to talk a little bit about who we pestered to take the survey, what the response rate was, and what the kind of representativeness was of the overall sector. So just 2 more slides, and then we'll get to results. So we identified 482 possible experts. We pestered them repeatedly to try to take the survey. Of those 482 individuals, we also pre-identified 42 individuals who we classified as leading experts. These were folks that, amidst the 482, struck our collective team and our advisors as people who were uniquely well endowed with information that we would like to access. And we did that. We split this into these 2 categories because a traditional expert elicitation oftentimes, in the end, involves surveying 4 people, 8 people, maybe 15 on the outside. That's, at least within the energy technology area, those are the typical sample sizes that we're talking about. And we were looking to get, well, OK, we didn't get 482. You'll see how many we got in a second. But we were looking at 482 folks. And so we wanted to, within that 482, identify a subset that would be run through a slightly more traditional expert elicitation, and that's represented by this 42 leading expert group. In terms, and I'll ignore this stuff for the moment and just talk about response rate. So in the end, 163 people responded to the survey, 34% response rate. 22 of the 42 so-called leading experts responded, so a slightly higher response rate for the leading expert group. You can see how that is split among various respondent categories. So you can see mostly North American and European experts. We actually mostly did try to draw North American and European folks into the survey, but with some representation from Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. You can see good representation for onshore wind and fixed bottom offshore wind. Not surprisingly, a smaller number of folks who felt comfortable answering questions about the more emerging floating offshore wind technology. And pretty broad organizational representation, certainly plenty of private sector folks here, but also 28 public research management type individuals, 15 folks from universities, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't look at response rate within each of these organizational categories, as I recall, but overall, a pretty solid response rate for this form of online survey, and especially an online survey that was asking people to dedicate a pretty significant amount of time to the enterprise. OK, so what the heck did we find? So we found that our experts, our median expert, let's start with that, our median expert and for the best guess or most likely cost reduction scenario. Our median expert anticipated 10% levelized cost of energy reductions for onshore wind energy by 2020, 24% by 2030, and 35% by 2050. These are all relative to respondent-specific starting baseline values from 2014. So we are pulling data, pulling experts from a lot of different parts of the globe. There's no reason to believe that a typical project in Switzerland looks anything like a typical project in the panhandle of Texas. And so we asked people to designate what their starting point value was in 2014, and then tell us how that cost might decline over time. You can see that for fixed bottom offshore wind, pretty similar percentage reductions, somewhat larger than for onshore. And then for floating offshore wind, there's not a single commercial floating offshore wind project in existence globally at the moment. And so we compared the future cost, 2020 through 2050, to a 2014 baseline for fixed bottom offshore. And so that's why this cost actually starts at a premium to fixed bottom offshore, but then shows declines over time.
So the fact that those declines are so similar, does that tell you it's actually just psychology and this is sort of a normal projection you make in the absence of other information? Or do you think that there is expert information that says that, I would just imagine that offshore wind has a more cost reduction to gain.
Yeah, so I think that I think that our experts, though they aren't experts in rocks, that if we'd asked them how much they thought the cost of rocks would decline in the future, they would have answered it differently. I would like to think that they would have answered it differently if we asked that. I think this, you'll get to this a little bit when we show this in absolute value terms. So we didn't actually ask anybody what their percentage cost reduction was. But when you get to the absolute values, which is actually what we were asking about, you will see significant differentiation here. So I think that there is an element of psychology that we have to be aware of, and it's hard to control for within these environments. But I don't think psychology is creating these similar numbers, because this is not what we were really asking people. It was a derived element of the survey. But we can get back to that in a couple slides when you see the kind of absolute value numbers, which was more like what we were asking folks. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty here, right? These were the median respondent for this kind of median or kind of best guess cost reduction scenario. This slide simply overlays on that same chart the 25th to 75th percentile of experts. And so this represents kind of the inner 50% of experts. Obviously, if we presented it from the 10th to 90th percentiles, it would be a broader range still. But you begin to demonstrate here that, yes, our experts believe that costs will decline in the future, but there's a pretty substantial spread in the degree to which they think those costs will decline in the future.
Do you have so many questions about historical costs or costs in different places? You sort of nail them and see these people know what they're talking about, which is not calling them experts?
We did not do that, but that's one of the reasons why we had this leading expert group. And you'll see a little bit later both the results from the leading expert group, which will be, I think, the next slide, and then also a little later on several other questions that we asked to try to better understand the internal consistency of people's answers. You know, are they just giving you something that's easy to give you, right? Like 50% cost reduction sounds good, so let's say something like that. Or is there really information content? So I think as we go through the presentation, you'll see that there is some real information content here. I'll say on a personal basis, I went into this project with a pretty high degree of skepticism of expert elicitation as a method. Part of that skepticism came from the fact that, at least in the energy community, most of the expert elicitation seemed to involve talking to like 4 to 12 people, which seemed to me to be not necessarily a representative sample of the number of experts that actually exist in the world on these technologies. And also because I was concerned about these kind of cognitive or motivational biases. You know, that being said, it's not clear what better methods there are. You know, should one simply rely on past data and say the future will be exactly the same? I don't know. That's what learning curves do, but there's something that doesn't feel quite right about that. I could ask my mother, but she's probably not going to be as good a guesser as an actual wind energy expert. And so I think as I went into the project, I was pretty skeptical. I still have some skepticism, which will emerge during the course of the presentation. But I think in overall, I was actually pretty surprised by the amount of internal consistency in people's responses. And so it gave me a little bit more comfort, a lot more comfort actually, on the end of the process than I went in with.
So
Yeah.
coming back to an earlier question, how much do you think that internal consistency is a function of the other cost analysis methods that people have seen? Is everyone just reading the same report and comparing it back and kind of forgetting what the exact percentage?
Don't know.
Have you done a comparison between
Yep.
those things? Okay.
Yeah, you'll see that. And you'll see that, in fact, our survey respondents are not fully consistent with the literature. So whether that means they're better than the literature or not, it's hard to know, but you'll see we've compared it to the broader literature for sure.
The baseline is almost at 8 cents per kilowatt hour. How is that? Is that just because prices are higher in other places? And you're
Yeah.
getting people from crappier wind locations?
Yeah, exactly. So the U.S. participants in general would have a much lower baseline value, and when they revise their baseline value, they would always revise it downwards. If you're in Germany, they're always revising their baseline values upwards, and so you can kind of think of this baseline as, in effect, kind of like an average of North America and Europe, in effect, which means it's not really. It's useful because percentage reductions are one way of normalizing some of this, but it also is a bit misleading because people do have very different starting points. So let's talk about the leading expert group. So we did, as I mentioned before, identify this kind of pre-selected list of leading experts. These included a wide range of public R&D type folks working at some of the leading research organizations in Europe and the US, as well as some of the core leading technologists at wind energy, turbine manufacturers and developers, basically the people who, in effect, created this industry over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades. In general, our leading expert groups were more optimistic than the broader set of folks. What this means, I don't know, but it is clear, certainly from our results, that this self-selected or our selected, pre-selected list, let's say, of leading experts were, in the end, more optimistic about cost reductions than the larger group of folks. I would have thought the opposite. I would have thought that this larger group was kind of more of a convenient sample. There'll be a bunch of people that are like really gung-ho about wind, but they know something about wind. We identified them as an expert, but maybe they haven't been in the industry for a long time. So for whatever reason, they might be very optimistic about the future of wind energy. And so I was anticipating that larger group would actually be the more optimistic group. So again, what that means overall, I'm not totally sure, but it gave me a little bit more confidence in the survey's result that the folks who we really trusted and in terms of their views ended up, in fact, giving a rosier picture than the larger group.
Is that something in other studies? Is there a consistency that leading experts tend to be more optimistic?
I'm not aware of anybody who's done this before, partly because, again, with it at least, I'm really familiar with the energy expert elicitations. I don't want to speak to the broader literature by any means, but certainly within the energy sphere, nobody's had a larger group. They've always only had kind of a leading expert group. Yeah.
Because those numbers are so scary similar. You'd think that floating wind that doesn't even exist yet, they would have this most super cost reduction in
Yeah.
technologies.
Yeah.
So this is weird to me that
Yeah, some of that weirdness will slightly disappear here, Liz, maybe, or maybe not. You'll have to be the judge of this. So this shows it in absolute value terms, and one has to be really careful in presenting in absolute value terms, because as you noted earlier, this starting point value is sort of meaningless. It's sort of some sort of weird amalgam of US and European projects, and so I'm not sure how meaningful it is. I mentioned earlier that in the US in 2014, 2015, the LCOE of wind projects was around $50 per megawatt hour, or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But you can see here that there is, in fact, a steeper decline for offshore wind technology costs relative to onshore. As you would expect, less mature technologies are showing steeper cost reductions than more mature technologies. You can also see far greater uncertainty in offshore wind costs than onshore, which is also kind of what you would anticipate. This is a less mature technology. We don't know as much about it. There's more disagreement about where that cost might go in the future. Now, a hallmark of expert elicitation is not only to ask about your expected outcome. It's also to elicit a probability distribution. And we weren't, given the fact that we were already requiring people to spend an hour of their time with an online survey, we weren't able to fully trace out the probability distribution, but we did ask for basically 10th percentile and 90th percentile values in the form of high cost estimates and low cost estimates as well. And the important point here is first to recognize that our experts clearly understand the deep uncertainties that exist in the future cost of wind energy. If you go from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile, you have a range of anywhere from no cost reduction, at least for onshore wind, in 2050 to about 50% cost reduction. So there's a huge range of uncertainty there. There's also a large opportunity space, right, for aggressive R&D, for industry-based learning, et cetera. So there's clearly a significant opportunity space for improvement, but by no means is that opportunity assured. We did ask folks, yep.
Have you tested, for example, the median curve? Have you tested the slope of this one against the slope of your historical data to see if the slope is steeper or less steeper or kind of the same?
Yeah, you'll see that in a few slides. Just wait and be patient. Not all answers will come for sure, but at least that singular answer will come. We did also ask about kind of some of the drivers for these cost reductions. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly in the interest of time, but we did ask folks kind of to what degree they thought achieving that low scenario, the really deep reduction scenario, would be driven by kind of public or private R&D investment versus industry-related growth and maturation, sort of learning-based advancement. Both were deemed quite important. We also asked, and we actually didn't ask any questions about the reduction in LCOE, right? So actually to this point, I've almost shown you none of the results from the survey. I mean, I've showed you the results of the survey in a derived form, but really what we asked people to do is to tell us what they thought the upfront installed cost of project would be, what did they think the capacity factor would be, what did they think the project design life, the cost of financing, and the operating expenditures. So we forced people to think about all of the 5 components which ultimately go into creating the levelized cost of energy for the year 2030. For 2020 and 2050, we allowed people to do curve fits, but for 2030, this is really what we were asking. We weren't asking what percent LCOE reduction do you think. We wanted to ask, based on your 2014 starting point value, where do you think CapEx is going to be? Where do you think OpEx is going to be? Where do you think capacity factor is going to be, et cetera? What we can see from this is that for onshore wind, most of the advancement is anticipated to come from capacity factor improvements, further improvements in project performance in effect, as well as, that's this one actually, as well as reductions in capital expenditures, with somewhat lesser contributions from project life and operating expenditures. For fixed bottom offshore wind, maybe not surprisingly, the CapEx stuff is the most important driver. These are enormous machines offshore. There's a huge amount of foundation and balance of plant related and installation costs, and you can see how improvements in upfront CapEx are going to be really important for that sector, as well as improvements in the cost of finance. As a less mature technology, our experts foresee significant potential cost reductions as a result of reducing the cost of finance for these projects as the industry matures. This was for the median scenario. We also did it for the low scenario, which I won't describe now.
Why would the finance cost reduction be greater? Isn't that just set by the cost of borrowing? I mean, why would it be so radically different for different technologies?
Risk.
Yeah.
They worry that your wind turbine will fall apart? I mean,
Yeah. That's basically right. Or just that the operating costs will far exceed expectations. And within the offshore wind sector, let me say, that has been the common occurrence. And so it's based on real historical data that they need to have a higher implicit cost of capital. We also asked folks about what do they envision in terms of the size of these turbines in 2030. And part of this is that we wanted to just, again, get that sense of internal consistency. If folks are saying that they expect a higher capacity factor in 2030 compared to today, then they better estimate a turbine that in a typical wind resource site would deliver higher capacity factors. And so we're able to do a little bit of confirmation of the survey by asking some of these additional questions. Again, I don't want to go through these details, much here. Suffice to say that they are consistent. For onshore wind, the expectations are for higher hub heights as well as larger rotor diameters relative to nameplate capacity. Both of those do and will result in capacity factor improvements, and capacity factor improvements that are reasonably consistent with what we were estimating on this particular slide. So there's a little bit of internal consistency there. Offshore wind, the expectation is that we're going to move from 4 megawatt machines that have been common over the last several years to 10 megawatt machines on average in 2030. That is very consistent with the belief that capital expenditures and reductions in upfront capital expenditures is the primary lever to reduce LCOE. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the foundation costs, the balance of plant costs are really enormous offshore, and so there is a need to move towards larger turbines to minimize those costs on an overall project basis, and that's certainly what is reflected in the survey responses. We did also force our respondents. This surely was the most painful part of the process for anybody who completed the survey. We identified 28 different possible advancement opportunities that exist between now and 2030, and we forced our experts to rate every one of them, of those 28. This slide simply shows the top 5 ranked items for each of the 3 wind technologies. If some of our experts did answer for all 3 technologies, and so they would have had to go through this 28-point list for all 3, which would have been quite a pain. But nonetheless, this list, again, is consistent with the previous ones in the sense of emphasizing turbine scale as a key lever for reduced LCOE, but not the only lever for reduced LCOE. Okay, how does this compare to the broader literature? At this point, I've talked about all of the survey results I'm going to talk to. Now I want to frame it a little bit within the context of the broader literature. And there's 2 comparisons that I'll make. The first, focus on onshore wind. What do these experts anticipate, and how does that compare with historical reductions in the LCOE of onshore wind? That's this slide. The next slide will then compare it to the broader literature that's used learning curves or engineering analyses or other techniques to forecast future costs. So we're trying to put it within the context of both historical data as well as other forecasts for future wind energy costs. So this slide, again, shows the comparison relative to historical data. Every one of the lines on this slide for the historical time frame represents a different estimate of historical LCOE. So one of them is a global number from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. One of them is a US number, courtesy of my team at LBL, one from Denmark, and one for some sort of typical coastal European site. The learning curve, I won't talk about the learning rate in a lot of detail mechanistically, but the learning rate kind of defines the slope of the decline, at least in log-log form. You can see the historical LCOE learning is anywhere from 10.5 to 18.6%, which means that with every doubling of cumulative installed onshore wind capacity, you see LCOE reductions of 10 to roughly 19%. If you look at our expert survey, the median, kind of the best guess scenario, and you associate that with different deployment pathways in the future, your learning rate would be anywhere from about 14 to 18%. So our experts believe the future will be a lot like what it was in the past in terms of the expected or kind of best guess estimate in the future. So the future look here is pretty consistent with historical LCOE-based learning. And I want to emphasize LCOE-based learning because one of my final points will come back to that particular issue.
Maybe I missed this. Did you ask the experts to forecast what the cumulative deployment would be in each of those years?
No, we didn't. So this is a range. This represents a range of deployment from IEA and the Global Wind Energy Council.
So they give you years, and then you're going to assign.
Yeah,
deployments.
and that's why there's this range. In retrospect, we probably should have asked that. This was a comparison that we thought of after the fact, not before the fact. We can also compare these estimates from experts, both the low cost reduction scenario, the middle scenario or median scenario, and the low cost scenario, with a much broader literature. That literature deriving from learning curve estimates, from engineering assessments, from put your finger in the air and make a guess. Who knows? There's a wide variety of ways that people have tried to forecast the future cost of wind energy. Every one of these little gray lines represents one of those different estimates. and our translation of those estimates into future LCOE terms. A couple things of note, starting with onshore wind. Clearly, our experts span the literature range, right? On the high end, we're at the high end of all the rest of the literature. The low end, we're basically at the low end. The most notable thing here is that our best guess scenario, our median scenario, happens to be a little bit more optimistic. Actually, if you look at the math, it's significantly more optimistic than the median or average of all of these gray lines. So this blue line tends towards the bottom end of the range of these gray lines. Our experts are somewhat more optimistic about future cost reduction potential than much of the existing literature. That suggests that our experts are not simply basing their estimates on the existing literature, but are bringing some new information, hopefully insightful information, to the table. For fixed bottom offshore, the story is a bit different. Here we've got, again, our surveyed experts' assessments, and you can see they tend to be towards the high end of the literature. So somewhat different picture between these two figures. So what do we conclude from the survey? First of all, there do appear to be significant opportunities for LCOE reduction still, both onshore and offshore, but our experts are also their views are very reflective of the deep uncertainties in the level of those cost reductions. And so the first and kind of obvious conclusion is that planning level assessments need to consider both. They need to consider perhaps an expectation for continued cost reductions, but also the very real uncertainties that exist in this space. We also find that improvements in the upfront capital cost of wind projects are expected to remain important, but by no means are they the only or even the primary, in terms of onshore wind, way of achieving lower LCOEs in the future. Instead, we also need to look at capacity factor improvements, OpEx improvements, and other. Somewhat consistent with that finding, and kind of the final finding listed here, is that it is true that historical LCOE-based learning curves match reasonably well with what our forecasts anticipate for the future. That being said, up until this slide that you saw, almost no one, with one or two minor exceptions, almost no one has actually traced a learning curve based on LCOE for wind. Almost every learning curve that you'll see in the literature is based on CapEx. And in fact, much of this literature, not all of it, but much of this literature is also hinged on these historical CapEx-based learning assessments. And one of our theses, not a proven thesis, but nonetheless one of our theses, is that one of the reasons that our experts are somewhat more optimistic than the broader literature is that some of this broader literature has been focused almost exclusively on thinking about only one of 5 of the levers that can reduce LCOE in the future. They're not seeing the full picture of possible LCOE reduction. So that's the survey. Let me open it up for any questions there. And if we have time, I will go to the final module and talk a little bit about what this might mean from a wind deployment perspective. But let's see if folks have any questions before going to this final module. Yeah?
Can you speak about the uncertainties and how that's such a significant variable? It seems like the uncertainties are really policy specific. The production tax credit, the phase out implications there, and state renewable portfolio standards, and how those might change or shift. Is that your assessment, essentially? I guess I'm not understanding what other risks or uncertainties present themselves in such a stark manner.
Yeah. So I think for land-based wind, one of the largest uncertainties is simply how much further can one go with turbine scale. Most of the not most, but a sizable fraction of the LCOE reduction historically has simply been figuring out how to build larger and larger turbines without proportionally increasing the mass and therefore the cost of those turbines. But there have been questions at every step of the way about whether we're at the limit of that scaling. If you asked folks in the wind sector 15 years ago, they would have said, I think 750 kilowatt turbines, that's the optimal size. If you'd asked people 7 years ago, they might have said, you know, I think 1.5 megawatt turbines is the optimal size. If you ask people now, I don't know what they say. But you know, there is this moving boundary, and I think there is a lot of uncertainty about where that boundary stops moving, because basic physical scaling laws tell you that the larger that these turbines are, the mass has to scale at a very significant pace, and it's only engineering innovations that enable that scaling not to occur. And so I think that is one of the core areas of uncertainty in the sector, is just how far engineers can go in pushing those boundaries.
So the mass hasn't been increasing as fast as the power?
It's been decreasing relative to the power.
Relative to power or total?
Relative to everything, relative to power, relative to swept rotor area, and relative to kilowatt hours. Yeah.
Thanks for putting all this data together. I just want to, anybody, or any young people here who are interested in both engineering and finance and economics, I think the very interesting challenges of developing a project now, the interplay of what you think electric prices are going to be both on a daily level and annual level going forward, what you think the best aerodynamics are for a wind blade, what you think the meteorology is at the different hub heights, the average wind speed, changes in wind speed, how that affects the operation and maintenance of a wind farm, the changes in wind speed, wear and tear, and so forth, and everything from material science, and you're blending a lot of things, and anybody who can meld all of those analytical areas, engineering, economics, meteorology, I think, can really drive those LCOEs down.
Yeah. Yeah, no, wind is complicated. I do a lot of work in solar as well. And man, solar is simple in comparison to wind from certain perspectives. Certainly from an engineering perspective, it's very simple. So let's move to the final module. I'm just going to run through this really quickly, and then we can open it up for some additional questions. But I do want to say a few words about deployment possibilities for wind energy, both in the US and globally, and tie this, maybe not very directly, but at least a little bit loosely, to the survey results that I just presented. And the first thing I would note is that wind is going to deploy in the US over the next 4 years. It's built in. It's built in because the production tax credit will remain at its full value for basically every project completed over the next 4-year cycle. And it's built in because the cost of wind energy has already dropped to the point where, with the production tax credit, it's hard not to think that it's a pretty good economic bet over the long term. And so for the next 4 years, expectations across a range of different people who make these forecasts suggest a continuation of an 8 gigawatt per year type wind market in the US. That being said, those same experts anticipate a drop-off after that 4-year build cycle. That drop-off is, of course, partly a consequence of the decline in the federal production tax credit over the same time frame, but it is also affected by a variety of other headwinds that I'd like to briefly, very briefly describe. The first is shale gas and the impact of shale gas on wholesale electricity prices. This kind of whatever this kind of color is, orangish, I guess, area represents wholesale power prices for a 24/7 flat block of power at a variety of interior US pricing points. The broader blue represents other pricing points outside of the interior, New York, New England, et cetera. And you can see that wholesale power prices in 2015, same is true for 2016, even more so, are averaging somewhere around 2 to 3 US cents per kilowatt hour. So wind with a 2-cent PPA with the production tax credit looks just fine against these wholesale power prices. Wind can compete with wholesale prices with the PTC. But you remove that PTC and that 2-cent project becomes a 3.7-cent project, and that's out of the money in the vast majority of regions of the country. Shale gas is a very, very potent competitor for wind and for any other technology on the system. And wind is not only competing with natural gas, it's also competing increasingly with solar in a growing number of regions. Solar now outcompetes wind in California by and large. Increasingly, it's outcompeting wind in the southwestern U.S. Certainly, folks in the wind sector are concerned that it might outcompete wind in Texas in the years to come as well. And you can see that power purchase agreement prices for solar, while still higher than wind, have declined at a much more rapid pace historically, at least over the time frame specified on this particular slide. So wind is competing against natural gas. It's progressively also in some regions of the country competing with solar as well. It's also important to recognize that in addition to being kind of a technologically complex energy source, wind energy is a kind of a messy energy source, right? It has a variable output profile. You can forecast that output profile in short durations, but you can't forecast it over long durations. And that has consequences on the grid as a whole. And study after study will demonstrate over and over again that technically that's a manageable thing. We can manage technically a variable resource up to much higher penetrations than we have today. But economically, it's not free to do so. And as a consequence, the value of wind energy in an electricity system declines with progressively higher penetrations. And that's been demonstrated by Leon Hirth here. It's been demonstrated by my colleague, Andrew Mills, here with this blue line, and through kind of a meta-analysis that Leon Hirth has also done, shown here as well. So as you get to progressively higher penetrations of wind, you're offsetting basically lower and lower cost resources that are in the bid stack in a wholesale market. And so the value of that wind energy has declined. This is one reason why people like talking about grid parity, but in fact, it's always a chase towards grid parity. As you increase your deployment, the actual point where you're competitive with natural gas, with coal, with the entire electricity mix declines progressively. And so there is this need for continued innovation, not only to achieve grid parity, but then to maintain grid parity at higher levels of penetration. Yeah, Michael?
Wouldn't that depend on the rule for pricing power in the bid system? If carbon-free electricity is always bid for first priority, that'd be different than if it doesn't have.
I would say it would not be different. So think about it this way. In the old world, natural gas was cheaper than coal. This is not so true anymore, but let's just say the old world still exists. So that first kilowatt hour of wind in a market that has both coal and natural gas will mostly offset natural gas, right? You'll offset the most expensive source on the margin. As you increase your penetration further, you're going to dig into that bid stack. You're going to start to offset more efficient natural gas, and eventually you'll start offsetting coal, which is a lower marginal cost.
Bid price includes the cost of carbon versus no carbon cost?
It would be true in both cases. In both cases, you're always initially going to offset the highest cost unit. The highest cost unit might be defined as private and social cost, right? You could have a carbon tax, and then that first cost unit would incorporate a carbon aspect, but it is still going to be the case that the second unit that you offset will be marginally a little bit cheaper than the first unit.
To what extent are your results here dependent on curtailment?
Here, they're actually not that dependent on curtailment. Most analyses of higher wind penetrations, at least up to sort of the sort of 40% point, don't find a great deal of curtailment if you have a reasonable, flexible energy system. That is very much different for solar. The marginal value of solar drops off a cliff far faster and swifter than wind, and it does so because of curtailment. And curtailment really starts driving it at even 20% penetration. But with wind, it's more of a kind of a random number generator. It can produce during any hour of the day. And so generally speaking, we're finding not as much of a curtailment risk as long as you continue to build out transmission and do kind of the simple things to try to keep curtailment at a relatively low level.
Does this build in black swan events of the sort where you have to have like installed natural gas peakers in order to accommodate a 1 in 1,000 decrease in wind that's correlated broadly with
Yeah.
the region?
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons that this value declines over time, is that those first megawatts of wind you can integrate into the system relatively easily. It offsets some other capacity on the system. But as you progressively increase wind, you can't rely on it to provide those reliability services during those peak hours, whether those peak hours are happening every year or whether the peak hours are more of the black swan variety. So let me just end with one or two more slides, and then we'll kind of open it up for just a couple minutes before we really end it. So what this all means is that the future of wind energy is uncertain. Now, this is like a total dud for this presentation, but it is what it is, right? So the future is uncertain. This is a slide from an IPCC report that I was involved with several years ago now, so it's a bit dated. It shows global scenarios for the penetration of wind energy under baseline scenarios, under progressively more aggressive climate mitigation scenarios. One doesn't have to look at the details here, and I have to say, as some in the room know, I'm a bit skeptical for the kinds of models that develop these results anyway, but suffice it to say that plausible scenarios show ranges of wind penetration of certainly less than 10% to more than 20% on a global basis, with quite a few outliers. Some more recent analyses, the IEA's World Energy Outlook has scenarios that range from 10 to 15, or 6 to 15% by 2040. The Global Wind Energy Council shows wind energy penetrations of anywhere from 17 to 31%. So it's uncertain. It's uncertain because of the cost of wind, but it's also uncertain because of all of those other factors that I just described, and perhaps the future cost of shale gas being ultimately more important than the future cost of wind energy. The same is true on a US basis. I'll just focus on this slide for the purpose of this talk. So this shows some recent analysis from the National Renewable Energy Lab that shows the amount of wind generation, in this case terawatt hours, from the present through 2050, and across a wide range of scenarios. These scenarios vary the cost of wind, but also vary the cost of natural gas, the amount of load growth or lack of load growth, and the amount of coal plant or nuclear plant retirements. And you can see very significant variations in the amount of deployment expected from wind based on all of those uncertain factors. And so, to conclude, can we get to 10%? Can we get to 20% wind energy penetration in the US and on a global basis? I think we can. There's no evidence to suggest that we can't, but achieving those levels of penetration assuredly will require that our experts are at least partly right. That is, that there will be continued technology advancements and cost reductions, at least to some degree, and probably also requires some other things to go right too. Whether that's carbon policy, whether that's incrementally aggressive renewable energy policies, whether it's increases in the cost of shale gas due to exports or other factors. And with that, we have just, 4 more minutes or so to answer any questions, and then we'll be done. Yeah.
Is there any thought about whether climate change potential might change wind patterns and therefore change the preferred siting locations for wind, or possibly even strand the capital of any existing location?
Yeah, so there's been quite a lot of research on that topic, both in the US and in Europe. And folks have generally found that, yes, wind patterns will change, and that, yes, given those changes, you might subtly alter site selection, but that those changes generally will occur over a sufficiently long period of time that it's unlikely to really create stranded assets per se. I mean, these are projects that have 20, 25-year lives, and so, yeah, the wind resource might incrementally get a little bit better or a little bit worse over that 25-year time frame, but really what you're worried about are 50, 100, 200-year time frames, at which point you can obviously, you're decommissioning one site, you can build another one somewhere else. And so it's definitely an issue, and an issue that's been pretty well studied. But I don't get the sense that it's dramatically impacting site selection today, and nor should it, given the duration of the time frame that we're talking about.
In one of your earlier slides, you showed the difference in penetration of wind across different states. And so I was wondering, to tie it together with at the end when you're saying 10% overall wind penetration, in some areas that could mean 400% penetration, and in others not. That it seems like what happens to the grid is going to play an important role in what the cost is and what the incentives are for doing that.
Yep.
Sort of, where does transmission fit in the analyses that you've seen with that?
Yeah. So we've done, I haven't shown it here, but we've done a ton of work looking at kind of the linkage between transmission and renewables integration, wind and solar. And there's two aspects of transmission that matter. The first is simply relying on the existing asset base efficiently. And the truth is we have poorly interconnected systems. I mean, even in places where we've got PJM and MISO don't speak together very well. They're not really a fully integrated system. We have no realistic interconnection between the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and Texas. In the West, it's like a land of different balancing authorities with weak links among them. Decent transmission, but not used for the purpose at hand. And so the biggest low-hanging fruit initially will be just a better integrated system, dispatching the system as a full system rather than a set of suboptimally dispatched island systems. That being said, it's also true that the best wind is in the middle of the country. We have wind in a lot of regions of the country, and so I don't want to necessarily suggest that we need an enormous amount of new backbone transmission to get to higher penetrations. But that would be the least cost option. Whether it's a practical institutional option is hard to know. And so transmission is going to play a key role, but I don't necessarily foresee or think it is essential to have a truly national backbone system to enable at least at the 20% penetration levels. Once you get to 40% higher, then you really need to move stuff to the load centers to a greater extent. Any takers? Yeah.
Just one thing, thanks for mentioning the external costs and the general decreasing trend in regional variations in the estimated external costs. Just want to suggest one other sort of a narrative economic sense, cost of coal mining itself. Coal mining is a very stressful and destructive thing. Just commend any 2 movies or 3 movies about coal mining, Map 1 or The Full Monty, Molly McGuire's The Last Mountain, look at coal mining in historical terms. It's a tough business. We've been seeing more on TV. I would suggest that's another hard to measure.
Well, it's a hard to measure externality, and it's not so clear how much of an externality it is, right? I mean, if you have a good-paying job in a coal mine, it might be dirty, it might be stressful, et cetera, but it's a good-paying job. And so the loss of that good-paying job is a painful situation in its own right.
Installing offshore wind turbines is at least as exciting.
Indeed. Indeed. All right. Thank you very much.